We need to rescue the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is exactly the objective of the Global Development Initiative.
China's Global Development Initiative, now 3 years on. How much impact is it having on our rapidly changing world? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. When Chinese President Xi Jinping addressed the 76th session of the UN General Assembly on September 21st, 2021, he unveiled a bold new vision to support all 17 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. At its core, GDI, as it's come to be known, aims to revitalize the global development partnership and mobilize resources to implement the UN's 2030 agenda, while promoting stronger, greener, and healthier global development. China's initiative prioritizes cooperation in 8 areas: poverty alleviation, food security, pandemic response and vaccines, financing for development, climate change and green development, industrialization, as well as the digital economy and connectivity. More than 100 countries and international organizations have expressed their support, and 70 have joined the group of friends of the GDI at the UN. There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Jorge Heine served as Chile's ambassador to China. He's currently a research professor at Boston University School of Global Studies. Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Also with us is David Monnier. He heads the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies. And Heine Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taiho Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Heine, the Global Development Initiative was launched at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. What are its primary objectives?
Well, it's one of 3 pillars by which China sees the multilateral world expanding, or let us say going forward. You have a situation where you have to have security, that's Global Security Initiative. You have to have respect, that's Global Civilization Initiative, respect for sovereignty. And then the Global Development Initiative. I mean, this is about sustainable development the world over. Every country has to have a path to development, but it must choose how it gets there. And that is exactly what the development initiative is all about. It's about allowing countries to have that freedom to choose. It's closely related to social development goals. There are about 17 that it talks about in terms of sustainability, et cetera. But that is the gist of it. How do you put together a world order that is both secure, has development, and respect?
And Heine, how does the GDI differ from Western approaches to governance and development?
Well, under China's model, it is, as I said, something that each country chooses for itself. There are different ways. I mean, you have countries that are so complex. They're this kind of matrix of everything from language, culture, religion, philosophy, literature, etc. And they have to find their own way. It cannot be imposed. The current model is we impose it, we tell you what's good for you, and you simply follow that. This hasn't worked. It's hard to see how it could. So right now, this is an idea that has come. Each country has to choose its own path.
Right. Ambassador Jorge Heine, the World Economic Forum estimates that trade between China and Latin America could increase to $700 billion by 2035. Now, the GDI addresses a whole host of issues, including global inequalities, poverty alleviation, food security, finance, climate change, green development, and the digital economy. It also talks about connectivity, all areas that China has vast expertise in. Where do you see the most need and the most benefit for Latin America?
Well, I will say this. I think that estimate from the World Economic Forum may in fact be too timid. Let me tell you the following. In 2015, I was in Beijing at the time, at the China Latin America Ministerial Forum. President Xi announced that in 10 years from then, that is by 2025, trade between China and Latin America would double. At the time, it was at $250 billion. Well, in 2023, that trade reached $485 billion. So all indications are that by 2025, that $500 billion goal will have been overcome, and that by 2035, we will be at much higher figures. So trade between China and Latin America has been in many ways the driver of the relationship, and it will continue to do so. Now, what do we need? What are the most urgent tasks? I would say that a critical element there is to change the matrix of this trade. By and large, this trade entails Latin America selling primary commodities, natural resources to China, and buying industrial products. What we need is to move in the direction which more value added is in the region. The good news is that something of that is already happening. We see investment by Chinese companies, say, in factories of e-vehicles in Brazil that have been announced and will materialize in the next few years, BYD and others in northern Brazil and in Sao Paulo. But I think we need a lot more of that. With China being the primary producer of e-vehicles and South America having so much copper and lithium that are key components of batteries for e-vehicles, I see a lot of complementarity there. And the key thing here is to move towards more value added in South America.
David Monnier, let's talk about China's relationship with sub-Saharan Africa. Well, China's become sub-Saharan Africa's largest bilateral trading partner over the last 20 years, and that is with a record $282 billion in trade last year. Of course, Africa has many challenges as well, including poverty, food security, the need for green development, connectivity as well. What role does the GDI play on the African continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa?
If you want to fully understand Africa's thinking, they have a document, Agenda 2063, that dovetails China's own way of looking at the world. Firstly, I think, is to look into the demand by Africans, Latin Americans, way back in 1955 in terms of transformation of the international institutions of global governance. And therefore, I think SDI came at the right time, that when we look at transformation of the global system, it is not just a question of United Nations Security Council seats. It goes all, including the language that is used. Currently, UN and all other agencies, they use Western culture, Western way of looking at it, Western models of development. And therefore, President Xi, whether it's in 2015 speech at United Nations General Assembly or at Davos, I think where he tables how China looks at the global South and more so on Africa, and move with these countries in terms of transforming the world that we live in, with the clear understanding that you cannot separate development and peace. I think you need to move in tandem with those two issues.
Right, David, you talk about the Western model of development, Western language, as well as Western culture. How does that change?
I think it changed by Africans and Chinese starting to respect each other, understand that their cultures are equal, and there is no any other culture more important than the other, whether it's Western culture. And therefore, in Africa, we talk about decolonization, of not just in terms of demanding space and seat in these spaces at a global level, but also to realize that our own culture is important and it is critical if we are to develop to ensure that it is respected globally, clearly with the respect of others, but as equal. So I think for Africans, when they look at President Xi Jinping and China's view on the GDI global in civilization initiatives as well as security, these terms are also something that Africans are demanding at a global level. And therefore, through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, I think you start to see the kind of respect, understanding, as well as reaching out to the developed countries in terms of the way of communicating and understanding each other.
Sourabh Gupta, there are more than 100 countries and international organizations that have supported the GDI, and the noted scholar Robert Kuhn, he says the GDI offers what developing countries need the most: long-term critical support with expertise and experience. How do you see it?
I totally agree with that sentiment. The most important thing to take away in the area of development is that it needs to be addressed comprehensively, and it needs to be done with patience and persistence. The reason the West has not been able to make a mark in this area the way China has is because the West sees us through the lens of charity, as if it's doing an act of charity for these folks. And secondly, it cannot be done on the cheap. And so there is this sort of fitful, episodic way in which the West has tried to do development. We see, we've had the Blue Dot Network and the program for global infrastructure and investment. But if one needs to point out and ask just exactly what is that and what has it done, I mean, one throws one's arms up and says like, oh, not exactly sure. This is where China has really excelled. I think a US government report just came out very recently, which showed that this is not GDI, I'm talking of the Belt and Road, where the Belt and Road has plowed in $680 billion into development in the global South, while the contribution of the West and the US is in the range of between 75 to 100 billion. And they are wealthier countries. They can do that. They need to have this sort of patience and persistence to do it, but they don't do that. And that is the problem, because China, as other commentators have just expressed, does this out of a position of mutual respect, does this from a position of patience and persistence. It has been a hallmark of President Xi's government administration that this is the way development should be done. And that is the reason China has been able to translate global development into a commercial opportunity too, not just as an act of charity. Just like China sees the opportunity, the green transition, not just as a sacrifice, but as a commercial opportunity, it has made development also an opportunity. And this makes it easier to be committed for the long term and to do it on a mutually respectful basis. And that's why I think China has prospered in this space.
Anna Tangen, over the past 2 decades, China has shifted its international development strategy from a bilateral one to a multilateral one, especially if we look at this outreach, the GDI. What's the advantage of that strategy?
Well, obviously time. I mean, you have 195 countries, depending on how you count them out there. This idea that you can have bilaterals with all of them doesn't make sense, especially when you have this idea that there are really principles that are necessary to be embraced in order for there to be a peaceful co-development. Remember, just saying a multilateral world does not mean that everything's going to be good. Multilateral could be chaos, or it could be consensus and cooperation. It depends on how countries view each other and how they understand each other. You know, my three co-panelists have indicated quite clearly that economic development and peace are absolutely hand in hand. You cannot have a situation where you have uneven economic development and still maintain a global order that can be respected in terms of non-kinetic action. Right now we have, 56 different conflicts going on involving 92 countries. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you have a current order which seeks to dominate countries, to make themselves great. They view themselves as the victims in this case, when in fact they should be providing the leadership, the values that are necessary for the country, for the world to go together forward.
Okay, we need to take a break. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point.
All you need to know about China. China 24, only on CGTN.
Welcome back. We're talking about China's Global Development Initiative, now 3 years on. Let's get back to our panel. Ambassador Heine, by focusing on the issue of uneven and inadequate development, the GDI aims to accelerate the implementation of the UN's 2030 agenda. I mean, we did hear the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres say, and I'm quoting him here, he said, "We need to rescue the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is exactly the objective of the Global Development Initiative." What is your view on that?
Yes, well, I will say this. A real turning point in the recent years was the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant a severe setback to the movement towards the Agenda 2030 of UN goals. Today, only, I think I was looking at some numbers, only 12% of the goals that were set are really on track. About 30% are, basically no-go. Some of them have even gone back. So we are in real trouble. After the pandemic, poverty increased, hunger increased. About 750 million people in the world today who are suffering from hunger. So what I would say is that the GDI responds to the need to accelerate development, to move us closer to achieve the UN's 2030 agenda. And in that sense, it's very important. And let me just refer to some of the previous expressions that we've heard on this program. A very important difference between China's approach to fostering development and the traditional Western approach to development is that China puts forth explicit mechanisms, also, in the case of the BRI, investment in infrastructure to facilitate development. The traditional sort of neoliberal approach has been that basically if you cut back on inflation and have inflation under control, if you create a suitable business climate, if you have social peace, development will happen on its own. Well, it doesn't. And it seems to me that the interesting thing about the Chinese approach is that you need action-driven initiatives. You need action-driven interventions into the economy, building ports, facilitating digital connectivity, making things happen, as opposed to this more passive approach that relies on the forces of the market. And that, it seems to me, is the significance both of BRI and the GDI.
And Ambassador, just to get back to the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, there clearly has been difficulty implementing that agenda. Why has there been such difficulty?
Well, again, as I said, it seems to me that the pandemic was a very important setback. And also, I would say, you look at the world today, we have, significant wars going on. We have massive human displacement. We have water scarcity. And all of these things have been around, and they haven't been addressed properly. And the problem is that the great powers, often more concerned, with their own petty squabbles than focusing on development issues. What the Global South claims for is for addressing these global challenges and moving the world towards solving them. And we haven't seen much of that. But it seems to me that JDI is one step in the right direction.
David Monnier, China's foreign direct investment in Africa has increased significantly, peaking at $5 billion in 2022. Beijing is currently involved in infrastructure projects in something like 35 African countries. Where is the most need for GDI in Africa?
I think there are a number of areas. I think what is core is the big infrastructure. Linking countries, as in the case in East Africa, we see the Mombasa-Nairobi rail, and it has to link up to Uganda and to Rwanda and Tanzania and other areas. In Southern Africa, it's the same issue. There's a lot of attention, especially at this stage, where the Westerners are also moving in, attracted by not just critical minerals in Southern Africa, but in their quest to push back China. They're also getting into what they call the Lobito corridor, Angola, DRC, and Zambia. So when you look at all these initiatives, Westerners are coming. It's a big plus for Africa that you have China massively moving in and Westerners. I think what is required for Africans to direct these initiatives, ensure there's a maximum benefits. As the case in Latin America, you need beneficiations to create more jobs. You need these roads and rail and dams to be built in areas where there's settlement, where there are people who can sell agricultural products and other initiatives, service sector. And there's a lot of thinking that is required, more so by Africans as they work with China mainly, and Westerners coming in, benefiting from all what we are talking about. But we need a number of initiatives. Agriculture, industrialization is core. Sectors that absorb more employment. I think more Africans need to be working. And more importantly and lastly, Africans to trade more among themselves. As it stands, they trade with outsiders than among themselves, and therefore integration is required to facilitate these initiatives.
Sourabh Gupta, clearly the GDI offers an alternate vision to that of the West. I mean, China's underlying philosophy is a win-win philosophy. And of course, there's a big financial component to all of this. BRICS and the SCO are creating new models, new financial arrangements. China established a special development fund to support GDI. The funding pool includes 1,000 projects. I mean, to what extent will these new financial arrangements, these new institutions, lessen dependence on Western banks and Western financial organizations?
I think they will reduce dependence, and will reduce dependence to a very significant extent, although it will not eliminate that need. At the end of the day, African countries and global South countries do want to tap global markets, bond markets for their development too. But that is not all, and as we've seen, the bondholders are the least cooperative at the time when there is debt distress, and they are the ones who says that everybody else must bear the burden. But anyway, setting that aside, China's role has been a very important one in this respect, because what China has done with regard to development in the global South is create an open platform. It is willing to cooperate with anybody who wants to coordinate with China in development in third countries. It is not that either you're with China or you are with the West. China is more than happy to have Western partners cooperate with the Belt and Road in building up the infrastructure in Africa and Latin America, and help incubate and fire up the manufacturing engines. What China can do in this regard is become a bigger consumer of these goods, because at the end of the day, if Africa can sell its products, can manufacture at home and then sell to China, export-oriented growth will create its own mechanism for development and prosperity. We had a brief moment when there were some countries like Japan who were willing to cooperate with, say, the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, but I'm afraid much of that has kind of petered away. But if Western countries can work in consensus and in coordination with China, I think the potential is tremendous. I think China has kept itself open for this sort of development, and the Global Development Initiative, I think, embodies this, because Belt and Road was it was bilateral, it was infrastructure and connectivity, while Global Development Initiative taps into the UN-centered system and the Sustainable Development Goals. There are action mechanisms to actually actualize these goals, and therefore China is playing the role of a responsible stakeholder in this area. It needs others to cooperate and coordinate with China.
Heine, what do you say to those critics who say that China's global initiative seeks to remake the world to its advantage? I mean, have we seen any evidence of that?
Well, I mean, quite frankly, I mean, this is something where if I do nothing and you do something, it's some sort of conspiracy. The fact is, there's no competition when it comes to unlocking the economic development of countries. China welcomes, as any kind of development initiative that helps any country. It's not like, oh, you can only accept our help, otherwise it's a bad idea. Respect, security, development, peace are all interrelated. So this, it is absolutely necessary that people recognize this. I mean, this idea that it somehow is a game that involves debt trap diplomacy is nonsense. These are just things that are being said by those who have done nothing. They've sat by the sidelines. They say that you have to develop the way we tell you to develop, a kind of this dominant narrative. But the fact is, the vast majority of countries want to have their own path to development, and they need to be respected in terms of the decisions they make for their country, decisions that do not need to be made in other capitals.
David Monnier, earlier this month, representatives from China, as well as 53 African countries, gathered in Beijing for this year's summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. You were at that conference. We have talked about this before, but what more can you tell us about what was accomplished in Beijing?
I think this year's forum was quite unique. I mean, if it was a marriage, one would describe it as a renewal of vows of some sort. It understood the forum itself, both Chinese and Africans, understood the world they are in and the challenge of a post-COVID world, a post-2008 global financial crisis, and all these challenges within China in terms of its economy slowing down a little bit, that they need to change and adjust some of the mega project and go to what President Xi Jinping says, small and beautiful, emphasizing much more on digital and connectivity to advance what Africans are really looking for, which is integration of the entire continent. And more importantly, to have 33 African countries, the poorest, to have tariff-free entry into a Chinese market, a sophisticated market for that matter, on agricultural products. And therefore, there's so much that came out in a way that undermines the kind of negative narrative that is coming from the West in terms of dealing with China on the continent.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.